TurboGrafx-16 was one of the most entertaining and unique consoles of its time, and also was the first console released in the 16-bit era. The system released 138 titles in North America. That included 94 games in the Turbo Chip format, 21 games in the TurboGrafx-CD format, and another 23 games in the Super CD format. The system was also the very first to implement a CD-ROM as a medium for storage for the games, with standout titles such as the Bonks and Legendary Axe series, Air Zonk, Newtopia, and even the very first Splatterhouse. Why couldn't this console survive in the gaming world?
TurboGrafx-16, the rise and demise.
2 times bigger and almost 10 times as many colors. Turbo action, turbo sound, TurboGrafx-16, the higher energy video game system.
God, this cord's about as long as my... The TurboGrafx-16 was released in North America on August 29, 1989 by both Hudson Soft and the NEC Corporation. Being developed in Japan, the system was released there almost 2 years before we ever got it on October 30th, 1987. In Japan, the console was referred to as the PC Engine. Sales in Japan were doing pretty good, so they decided to give it a crack in the North American market. Yeah, buddy. While NEC was doing market research here in the States, they discovered that the PC Engine name would cause too much confusion, that it was a computer and not a video game console, so they rebranded the name in North America to the TurboGrafx-16 Entertainment Super System.
And you say you want to play this game? Splatterhouse, only for the TurboGrafx-16 system from NEC.
They also decided to change the look from the small PC Engine to a larger black console.
Once you go black, hey.
Originally intended to compete with the NES, the console in reality had to compete with the Sega Genesis, which had just been released 2 weeks prior, and then 2 years later, it had to compete with the Super Nintendo. The TurboGrafx was the first 16-bit console released, which meant it was the first video game console in the 4th generation of gaming. The CD-ROM edition was also released in North America, known as the TurboGrafx CD. Also, it is the only major console ever to include a multi-form turbo-capable controller. That's right, no more finger blast in that controller. Unfortunately, the system failed to break into the North American market, selling a mere estimated 2.5 million units in its lifetime. It did roughly sell another 7 million in Japan though. This may not sound too terrible, but if you compare it to that of its major competitors such as the Genesis, which sold 29 million, and the Super Nintendo that sold 49 million, it's clear that this Brown just didn't make it to the Super Bowl.
Taught him how to do that.
One major flaw in the console was the fact that the actual system only contained one controller port. They did offer the Turbo Tap that allowed up to 5 players, but I believe it was a major flaw and a big determining factor for consumers who are undecided. Another major downfall in the console was the fact that game developers weren't allowed to release all of the games they could in Japan because Nintendo had an agreement that they weren't allowed to produce games for other companies due to contracts and licensing, so there was very little third-party support. They were basically shit out of luck. Also, although being marketed as a 16-bit console, it still had an 8-bit processor running the 16-bit graphic chips. And according to GamePro.com, the TurboGrafx-16 is the number 9 worst-selling console of all time in North America. The TurboGrafx-16 may have just been ahead of its time. It had all the workings of being a great console. You could play up to 5 players. The graphics were exceptional for their time. The hue cards are pretty dope. You had the Turbo CD attachment that connected to your console. The cover art for the games is some of the best ever, and you could even play it on the go with the Turbo Express. All of these positives, but it just couldn't compete with the lack of third-party support, better marketed, name brand recognized consoles of its era.
rumbling, hunger, pain, struggling, mumbling to myself, I don't want none of this.
No one sure.
Why are we doing this?
Hey, would you do 95 for a scratch on the back?
No. Is this gonna be worth it?
Alright, good deal, man.